very much, Andrew, for that. Handing straight over then to Ben, who I said earlier is the chairman of the BOW Group, the conservative think tank. So we introduced you before you were here, so the floor is yours now.
Thank you. Well, I think we've touched on it in the discussion so far, but we're really talking about two separate things here this morning, which are linked by the word economics, but it's economic disillusionment, i.e. disillusionment with the current economic system, but also I think disillusionment with economics itself as a prism through which to view the world. There are two quotes which I think bookend the political era which has just come crashing to an end. The first is Bill Clinton's campaign slogan, "It's the economy, stupid." And the second is a far less well-known quote, but I think equally important, evidence of an era ending with a whimper rather than a bang. But it was an article that George Osborne wrote for the Times about 2 months ago, which included the quote, "We thought it was all about the economy. We were wrong." I started working with a guy called Andrew Breitbart about 7 or 8 years ago, and he ran a little website called Breitbart.com. And his pitch was essentially that politics is downstream of culture. Culture is the focus of civilization, of society, not economics or politics or anything else. And our societies, our culture, looking at the United States, where Andrew Breitbart was from, and the United Kingdom, our society used to be underpinned by God, King, country. That is an idea that has passed from the public discourse. But in America, it's still talked about in similar terms in the sense of faith, family, freedom. These are the pillars that underpin American society, and they were the pillars that used to underpin British society. The problem is that the era which we have just had, the globalist liberal era of the politics of the third way, tore down those pillars in the West, but didn't replace them with anything. Or at least what they were replaced with was consumerism and seeing the world through the basis only of economics. And what I found very interesting about the Brexit campaign was not the support for Brexit in communities where there was clearly economic deprivation and a disillusionment with the current economic system. It was in the very wealthy areas where people were doing extremely well, supposedly under the EU system, under the globalist liberal economic system, but were totally dissatisfied by the direction the country was heading in. And people talk about Trump's victory as being a black swan event, but you look at all the polls going into it, and people talk about how now the polls are totally inaccurate and they can't be trusted at all. But one very interesting one, which has tended to be the predictor of who will win the election, or indeed whether the incumbent will stay in power, was people were saying they were satisfied with, broadly satisfied with economic performance in the United States, broadly satisfied with their lives from an economic and financial standpoint. But then you'll get a total skew with people who said they were, whether as to the question as to whether people were happy with the direction the country was headed in. And 68% of Americans were unhappy with the way the United States was moving. So totally satisfied with economic performance, totally satisfied or largely satisfied with the amount of money they were making, pretty much dissatisfied with the direction the country was headed in. And this, I think, is because, in my view, the modern left has created what many describe as the year zero theory, that the world has got a tremendous number of problems. Humankind have been doing it the wrong way for the entirety of human civilization. We're going to redraw everything. The sort of Marcuse, Gramsciite, cultural Marxist approach. We're going to tear down all the old pillars and rebuild them. The problem with that, and of course many of the people that set about on that political journey were very, very bright indeed. The problem with that is they didn't have the collective weight of thousands of years of human civilization, learning and history behind them. And so they created a society, in my view, which was bound to collapse, first culturally and socially, and secondly, economically. I'm a student of international relations, and the two great theorists, the great competing theorists in the period that I was studying, and arguably still, were Samuel Huntington and Francis Fukuyama. Francis Fukuyama said that we have reached the end of history. Liberal democracy is the inevitable mode of government, and therefore globalization is inevitable. Nation states are a thing of the past. The role of the nation state is simply to build a museum of its past civilization and to move forward into global international organizations and institutions. Huntington took the view that partially because of fundamental cultural differences, partially because of the human need for identity, and partially because the reality of resource scarcity, that the future would actually see a great clash of civilizations, almost a tribal war of all against all, which is essentially the question that civilization initially set out to answer. How do we avoid constant warring and constant tension? I thought it was very interesting what Stuart said about the Thatcher years, the switch to free market liberalism. Margaret Thatcher was not a liberal. I knew Margaret Thatcher. My grandmother knew Margaret Thatcher very well. Margaret Thatcher was a dyed-in-the-wool conservative. The economic reforms in which she instituted were, I think, necessary. But I spoke to Margaret Thatcher in 2012, and then she still had moments of lucidity. And she said to me, and she'd said this many times previously, that her greatest regret was being able to implement economic Thatcherism, but not cultural Thatcherism. And so there was a missing part of the puzzle. She couldn't understand how people in the city would sell their country down the river just for money. She didn't understand that. A lot of people see Margaret Thatcher as being, throw it open to the market, a globalist, someone who wants to let the market dictate. She was someone who very much saw the world through the prism of nationalism, through Great Britain as a nation independent of all others, and she couldn't understand that selfishness.
Collapse of civilization.
A predictor. I haven't even got to the bad bit yet. She
Really have collapsed. To interrupt your flow.
yeah. Well, there you go. Is that a no platforming? Does that count as a no platform? Is that student rights? The views of the rights. And I remember there was a guy called Professor Key who came to speak to the Bow Group. He was responsible for the Financial Services Agency and Authority, and the the reforms that were implemented post the 2008 crash. And he said one of the fundamental differences that he noted was that up until really the 1970s, if you were to take over a company and become the director or the chairman of a major sort of FTSE 100 equivalent company in the UK, you would see your task as one of shepherding that company, as one of handing over to your successor an organisation in a better state than the one in which you found. In other words, a responsibility to place an organisation and institution. He said the difference between the people that were running companies, major companies in 2005, 6, 7, 8, was that their primary interest was how much money they were making. And that might be a rather trite analysis, but I do think it's true. Because we have pulled down the pillars of society, I think it was Philip Larkin who said, there is no country now, all we can leave our children is money. And that isn't enough. That isn't enough for people. It doesn't matter really how wealthy they are. There is a fundamental unhappiness that is only served by a sense of belonging, a sense of place, and a sense of purpose that money on its own cannot bring most people. And when it was said that Brexit and Trump don't answer any questions, they make the world a more difficult place, that may be true, but they do answer the question of identity and place and belonging and meaning. I know quite well two men, one of them Steve Bannon, who in my opinion is now running the United States of America. And it's not just my opinion, but there are differing opinions. But and Nigel Farage, who, in my opinion, is the most influential politician by far of our current age, and indeed probably the most influential politician since Margaret Thatcher. Neither of those two men, whilst they understand economics relatively well, are interested in economics. They almost never talk about economics. They talk constantly about culture. They talk constantly about rebuilding a sense of patriotism, a sense of nationhood. And clearly, they have a point. And I think that is something that the left, and indeed the modern Conservative Party, which is of the left in most cases, do not understand. And my view is that it is actually part of human nature. I don't think there will ever be a time where humans don't have that need for a local and a cultural belonging. And that is a question that economics simply cannot answer. However, I was very impressed by Stuart's speech. I sit on a lot of these panels, and inevitably I'm usually in the minority as someone from the right, because most conservative debating societies don't tend to know what's going on the right or who to invite to speak, so they accidentally invite me. But from what Stuart said, I don't understand why Ed Miliband did so badly. Perhaps it is purely down to Ed Miliband as an individual, but what he said was to my mind quite an accurate analysis, and did include some of the things that I'm talking about, i.e. understanding that globalization is not the answer to all of our problems, and there has to be a counterbalance to it. What I haven't heard mentioned so far, surprisingly, is that the global economy in which we live, just looking at the economic perspective to look through that lens, is bankrupt. It is bankrupt in an economic sense, not just in a cultural sense. I thought it was very unfair what
few more minutes.
I thought it was very unfair what happened to Michael Gove and the lampooning he received for talking about so-called experts. Of course, the way that was received by the mainstream media, and that's not to ignore the positive coverage he got, but he got a lot of negative coverage saying, oh, have we reached an era where we're looking down our nose at experts? That's not what Michael Gove was talking about at all. He was talking about so-called experts. The so-called bit is crucial. Half of the people in the public discourse now are actually total charlatans who happen to have credentials but get everything wrong. I've debated on a number of occasions with the US economist Paul Krugman. He's extremely well paid, far wealthier man than I. He tours universities throughout the United States earning £50,000, £60,000 a speech. He pretty much gets everything wrong. This is a man who was asked when the economy will recover from Donald Trump's presidency. Never. It recovered from Donald Trump's presidency and actually rose on the basis of his election within an hour of the result in Ohio coming in. This is a guy who said the internet wouldn't, change economic performance. He's an example of the so-called expert. Someone who you will see in the mainstream media, read in the Financial Times, but will fundamentally get things wrong. And one of the main things that he gets wrong, and indeed one of the main things that the panel has got wrong so far, is to talk about austerity. It's a funny kind of world where you talk about borrowing 150 billion more than you're taking in the exchequer as being austere. I see that as the exact opposite of austerity. And it is rather worrying that this is a so-called far-right government. Obviously, I disagree that it's far-right. But if this is austerity under the Conservative Party, then when are we going to pay down the more than 1 trillion of debt the United Kingdom is in? When is the United States going to pay down the 20 trillion of debt that it is in, that rose under Bush, Obama, and I suspect will continue to rise under Trump? The United States now has a debt to GDP ratio of 104%. So what happens when the next recession hits? Greece, going into the 2008 economic crisis, had the exact same debt to GDP ratio. My view is, and it's very difficult to track statistics on this, but the global economy is overvalued by about 60%. The link between productivity and economic analysis is broken. There was a recall of Alan Greenspan in the Bath saying he was looking at figures showing economic performance and productivity and couldn't understand why they didn't meet up, but eventually just decided that because the economy was rising, it's not a problem that should be looked into. That problem faced us in 2008, and we have not addressed it. The next recession will probably completely wipe out the Western economy, and that is an almost apocalyptic scenario. So I think firstly, to summarise, economics itself is not the only lens with which to view the world, and indeed is not the most important one. And as politicians, political actors, political thinkers, if you view the world through the economic lens only, you will miss a lot, and events like Brexit and Trump will take you by surprise. But secondly, looking at the world through an economic lens, there are fundamental problems that have been caused by the era of fiat money and neoliberalism, which is not far right at all. The Americans understand rather better than we do that conservatism and liberalism are opposite poles, not the same thing. I am very sceptical that any politician will rise that is able to address the issue of the bankruptcy of our economy. Brexit answers it to an extent because the Eurozone is structurally flawed, and as far away as we get from that, the better. But I'm not sure any of us here, and I do mean us, because I don't think it will be that long before it happens, will escape the coming collapse of the Western economy. And quite frankly, economic disillusionment at the moment will be nothing in comparison to what is to come.
Thank you very much. So for on that,
Yeah, I told you the mic falling over. That was nothing.
on that cheerful note, I think we still have